When 3-year-old Mercy was abandoned by her own family on the Texas frontier in 1847, left to die beside a creek with nothing but 3 pieces of hardtack, she believed their words that she was worthless, until Swift Arrow, a Comanche hunter, discovered her fevered body and saw something her own people had missed. Now, torn between 2 worlds that couldn't be more different, Mercy must make an impossible choice that will define not just where she belongs, but who she truly is. But what happens when a child raised to believe she's a burden discovers she might actually be a gift? The wagon wheel hit another rock, and Mercy's head bumped against the wooden side so hard she saw stars. She pressed her lips together tight because crying would only make things worse. Much worse. "That child is eating us out of house and home." Thomas Brennan's voice cut through the hot Texas air like a knife through butter. He didn't even try to whisper anymore. 3 grown men could live on what she eats in a week. Mercy clutched her cornhusk doll closer to her chest. The doll's button eyes had fallen off months ago, leaving dark holes that looked just like how Mercy felt inside, empty and forgotten. She counted the wooden boards above her head for the 100th time today. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Counting helped her forget the growling in her stomach. "She's just a little girl, Thomas." Mama's voice sounded tired, like she'd been carrying heavy buckets all day long. "She don't eat that much." "Don't she?" Thomas snorted like an angry bull. "Yesterday I caught her sneaking extra hardtack. Yesterday, when we're already 3 days behind schedule because of her weak legs." The summer sun beat down on the wagon cover like a giant hammer. Sweat dripped down Mercy's face, but she didn't dare wipe it away. Moving meant making noise, and making noise meant reminding them she was there. Being invisible was her best trick these days. She pulled out the small wooden bird her papa had carved for her before the fever took him away forever. Its blue paint had worn off from all her touching, but she could still see where papa's knife had made each tiny feather. She whispered to it like always, "Papa, please make me good enough so they'll want to keep me." The bird didn't answer. It never did. Through a gap in the wagon cover, Mercy could see other families walking beside their wagons. Children ran alongside the wheels, laughing and playing games. Their parents called to them with voices full of love, not anger. Those children got extra water when they were thirsty. They got piggyback rides when they were tired. Mercy wondered what made those children different from her. What magic thing did they have that she was missing? "We're burning daylight because of her," Thomas continued, his voice getting meaner with each word. "Other families are already miles ahead. We'll be eating snow in the mountains because we're moving at the pace of a sick turtle." "She's trying her best," Mama said, but her voice sounded smaller now. "Her best ain't good enough for surviving out here. You got to choose, Sarah. Her or making it to California before winter. Can't have both." Mercy's heart stopped beating for a whole second. Choose. That was the scariest word in the whole world. When grown-ups had to choose, kids like her usually lost. She remembered the last time someone had to choose. It was when Papa got sick with the fever. The doctor had said someone needed to take care of Papa, but someone also needed to work the farm. Mama chose to stay with Papa. The farm died, and then Papa died anyway. And then Thomas came along with his promises of a new life in California. Now Thomas was making Mama choose again. The wagon lurched to one side as they went around a big rock. Mercy's wooden bird fell from her hands and bounced across the wagon floor. She crawled after it, but the wagon hit another bump and sent her tumbling into the side wall. "What's all that racket back there?" Thomas's voice boomed like thunder. "Nothing," Mercy called out quickly. "Sorry. I'm sorry." "Sorry, don't make us move faster," Thomas grumbled. Mercy found her bird wedged between 2 flour sacks. She held it tight and closed her eyes. In her mind, she could see Papa's face, kind and gentle, telling her stories about brave little birds who found their way home no matter how far they flew. But this wasn't a story, and she wasn't brave. She was just a burden on wheels, slowing everyone down, eating food that belonged to stronger people. Outside the wagon, she could hear the sound of other families calling to each other, planning where to stop for the night, sharing news and jokes. Their voices sounded happy and full of hope. Inside her wagon, there was only the sound of wheels creaking and Thomas's angry breathing and Mama's sad silence. Mercy pressed her face against the wooden bird and made a wish on it like Papa had taught her. She wished to be good enough, strong enough, small enough that maybe Thomas would change his mind. Maybe if she ate even less food and walked even more miles and never, ever complained about anything, he would see that she was worth keeping. But deep down in her heart, in the place where scared feelings lived, Mercy was starting to understand that some wishes were too big for wooden birds to carry. The creek sparkled like diamonds in the morning sun, and for just a moment, Mercy forgot to be scared. She hadn't seen water this clean and pretty since they'd left home. Fish swam in the shallows, and cottonwood trees offered shade that felt cool as a church on Sunday. "Everyone out," Thomas announced, jumping down from the driver's seat. "Horses need water and rest." Mercy climbed down carefully, her bare feet finding the sandy ground. The other wagons in their group had already disappeared over the next hill, their dust clouds getting smaller and smaller. She wanted to ask why they weren't following, but asking questions always made Thomas angry. Mama was moving slow today, like each step hurt her bones. Her face looked pale as milk, and she kept pressing her hand against her forehead like she was trying to push away a bad headache. "Mercy, honey," Mama called in a voice that sounded strange and shaky. "Come here to me." Something cold grabbed Mercy's stomach and squeezed tight. Mama only used that voice for serious things, like when Papa was dying, or when they had to sell their last cow for traveling money. She walked over to where Mama stood by the wagon wheel. Thomas was unhitching the horses, his movements quick and jerky like he was mad about something. "Sit down here beside me," Mama said, patting a fallen log. Mercy sat, her wooden bird clutched in both hands. Up close, she could see that Mama's eyes were red and watery, like she'd been crying or was about to start. "You remember what I taught you about following the North Star?" Mama asked. "Yes, ma'am." The words came out as a whisper. "It points the way home." "That's right. And you remember the story about the Henderson family? The nice folks with the big farm who need help with their children?" Mercy nodded, though her throat felt like it was closing up. She remembered the story because Mama had told it 3 times in the last week. The Hendersons lived 2 days north of here, and they were looking for a girl to help with cooking and cleaning and watching the little ones. "Well, honey, we've been thinking." Mama's voice cracked like a broken dish. "The wagon is awful heavy, and we're moving so slow." "I can walk more," Mercy said quickly. "I can walk all day and never complain. I promise." "Oh, sweetheart." Mama reached out like she wanted to touch Mercy's face, but then pulled her hand back. "It ain't about walking. It's about what's best for everyone." Thomas appeared beside them, carrying a small bundle tied with rope. Mercy recognized her extra dress peeking out from the cloth, along with her corn-husk doll and what looked like food wrapped in brown paper. "The Hendersons are good people," he said without looking at either of them. "They'll treat you fair, give you work to do, food to eat, better than what we can offer." The cold feeling in Mercy's stomach spread through her whole body like ice water. "You're leaving me here?" "Not leaving," Mama said quickly. "Taking you somewhere better, somewhere you'll be wanted and needed, and I'm wanted here." Mercy jumped up from the log, her wooden bird falling into the dirt. "I can be better. I can eat less and walk faster and carry heavy things and never cry, not even once." Thomas shook his head. "It ain't about being better, girl. It's about survival. Every pound in that wagon matters. Every mouth to feed matters. You're old enough to understand." But Mercy didn't understand. Not really. All she knew was that the people who were supposed to love her forever were packing her things like she was an old coat they didn't need anymore. "Mama?" She looked up into her mother's face, searching for some sign that this was all a terrible joke. "Mama, please don't make me go." Mama's face crumpled like wet paper. "I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. But the Hendersons will take good care of you, and maybe when we get settled in California, we can send for you." It was a lie, and they all knew it. California was 1,000 miles away, and poor people didn't send for anyone. Thomas handed Mercy the bundle. "Follow the creek north for 2 days. Stay close to the water so you don't get lost. The Henderson place is the big white house with a red barn. You can't miss it." Mercy took the bundle because she didn't know what else to do. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold onto the rope. "Be good," Mama whispered. And then she turned away and climbed back into the wagon. Thomas hitched up the horses without saying another word. The creek kept sparkling and the birds kept singing and the fish kept swimming like nothing important was happening at all. When the wagon started moving, Mercy ran alongside it for a few steps. "Mama, Mama, I'll be so good. I promise I'll be the best girl in the whole world." But the wagon didn't stop. The wheels kept turning and the horses kept walking, and soon all she could see was dust hanging in the air like a ghost. Mercy stood by the creek holding her bundle and watching the place where her family had disappeared. She waited for them to come back, to realize they'd made a terrible mistake, to remember that she belonged with them. But the sun moved across the sky and the shadows grew longer and no one came back for her. Finally, when the air started to cool and the crickets began their evening songs, Mercy understood that she was truly alone. She picked up her wooden bird from where it had fallen and brushed off the dirt. "Well, Papa," she whispered to it, "I guess it's just you and me now." The creek bubbled and laughed as it flowed north toward the Henderson place, toward people who might want her or might not, toward a future that belonged to everyone except the little girl who would have to live it. The rattlesnake's warning buzz froze Mercy's blood as she reached for wild berries on her 4th day alone. She had been crawling on her hands and knees, too weak to stand properly, when her small fingers nearly brushed the coiled serpent hiding beneath the thorny bush. The snake's diamond-patterned body was thick as her arm, its triangular head raised and ready to strike. Mercy held perfectly still, remembering her father's teachings about staying calm around dangerous creatures. Her stomach cramped with hunger so fierce it made her dizzy. The few berries she had managed to find yesterday had made her sick, but she didn't know which ones were safe to eat. Everything looked the same in this endless sea of grass and scattered trees. The creek had grown smaller, barely a trickle now, and she wasn't even sure she was still heading north. The snake slowly uncoiled and slithered away into the tall grass. Mercy collapsed backward, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against her ribs. Tears leaked from her eyes, but she was too dehydrated for real crying. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her tongue felt like sandpaper in her mouth. "Papa," she whispered to the wooden bird clutched in her trembling hand, "I don't think I can do this anymore." A shadow passed overhead. Mercy looked up to see buzzards circling lazily in the blue sky. She had seen enough dead animals on the trail to know what those black birds meant. They were waiting for her to stop moving, stop breathing, stop being a problem for anyone. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe everyone would be happier if she just stayed here and became part of the prairie grass. Her mother wouldn't have to worry about her anymore. Thomas wouldn't have to share his food or slow down his wagon. The world would keep spinning without Mercy Whitman taking up space in it. But then her father's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, "You're stronger than you know, little bird." Mercy forced herself to sit up. Her vision swirled with black spots, but she gritted her teeth and refused to fall. She had to keep moving. Not because anyone was waiting for her, but because giving up felt like proving Thomas right about her being useless. She stumbled to her feet and took 3 shaky steps before her legs buckled. As she hit the ground hard, her father's wooden bird flew from her grasp and tumbled toward the creek. "No!" Mercy lunged forward, but her movements were clumsy and slow. The bird hit the water with a tiny splash and immediately began floating downstream. This time, the tears came hot and fast. That wooden bird, was the last piece of her father she had left. It was proof that someone had once loved her enough to carve something beautiful just for her. Without it, she truly had nothing. Mercy crawled to the water's edge and stuck her whole arm in, reaching desperately for the bird as it spun away in the current. The water was cold and moved faster than it looked. Her father's gift disappeared around a bend, gone forever. She pressed her face into the muddy bank and sobbed until her chest ached. The crying made her even more thirsty, but she couldn't stop. All the fear and loneliness and hunger crashed over her like a flash flood. When the tears finally stopped, Mercy lay still beside the creek, watching clouds drift across the sky. A part of her wanted to stay right there and let the buzzards have their way. But another part, a stubborn, angry part, that sounded like her father, refused to quit. She cupped water in her hands and drank, even though it tasted like mud. Then she forced herself to stand again. Her legs shook like newborn colts, but they held her weight. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and Mercy shivered. She had heard stories about wild animals that hunted at night, stories about children who wandered off and were never seen again. But the sun was getting low, painting the prairie gold and orange, and she needed to find shelter before darkness fell. She spotted a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. It wasn't much, but it might provide some protection from wind and predators. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, but Mercy kept moving. As she reached the rocks, her foot caught in a prairie dog hole. She tumbled forward, skinning her knees and palms on the rough stone. Fresh blood mixed with the dirt already coating her skin. Mercy curled up between two large boulders as the first stars appeared overhead. The rocks still held warmth from the day's sun, but she knew the night would be cold. She pulled her torn dress tight around her legs and tried to make herself as small as possible. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Then another answered from a different direction. The sounds should have been scary, but instead they made Mercy feel less alone. Even the wild creatures had families, had others who called back to them in the night. "I'm still here," she whispered to the stars, her voice barely audible. "I'm still fighting." But as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, Mercy wondered how much fight she had left in her small body. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new tests of survival. And she would face them completely alone, with nothing but her own stubborn will to keep her alive. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like hope, though Mercy was too tired to recognize it yet. Swift Arrow had been following the wolf pack for 3 days when their trail led him to something unexpected. The wolves had been hunting a wounded deer, and Swift Arrow needed to know if they were moving closer to his band's territory. Wolves meant danger for children and horses, but they also meant the deer were migrating, which could signal good hunting ahead. He crouched beside a cluster of rocks, studying the ground for paw prints and scat, when he caught a scent that didn't belong, the sweet-sour smell of sickness, mixed with something else, something human. Swift Arrow followed his nose around the boulder and found her. The white child lay curled between two stones, like a small animal seeking shelter. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and dried tears, and her pale skin was burned red from the sun. She breathed in quick, shallow gasps that told him fever had taken hold. In all his 25 winters, Swift Arrow had never seen anything quite like this. White children didn't survive alone on the prairie. They didn't know how to find water or which plants were safe to eat. They certainly didn't travel this far from the wagon roads without horses or adults. Yet here she was. Swift Arrow studied the area around the rocks, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken grass. The child had been here for at least one full day and night. Before that, her trail led back toward the creek, where he could see the signs of her struggles, places where she had fallen, marks where she had crawled when walking became impossible. Most puzzling were the wagon tracks he had spotted earlier, leading west toward California. They were old enough to match the timeline of when this child had begun her solitary journey. But wagon tracks led away from where she had been found. not toward it. Swift Arrow knelt beside the sleeping girl and placed his hand near her mouth, feeling for breath. It came warm but uneven against his palm. Her skin burned with fever, but she was alive, barely. Among his people, children were sacred gifts from the Great Spirit. Even enemy children were often adopted rather than killed, because all children carried the future in their small bodies. But this was different. This child belonged to the white world that had no place for Comanche ways. If he helped her, he would face questions from his band that he wasn't sure he could answer. Why risk their safety for a white child? Why bring trouble to their peaceful camp? His uncle, Standing Bear, already grumbled about Swift Arrow's tendency to help wounded animals instead of leaving them for the buzzards. But if he left her here, she would be dead before the next sunrise. The child stirred, her eyes fluttering open to fix on his face. Swift Arrow expected screaming. Most white children were taught that Indians were monsters who ate small girls for breakfast. Instead, she whispered something that surprised him. "Are you real? Or am I dreaming?" Swift Arrow had learned English from traders and missionaries over the years. The language felt clumsy in his mouth compared to the flowing sounds of Comanche, but he could speak it well enough. "I am real," he said quietly. The girl's eyes were bright blue, like winter sky, but they held an old sadness that didn't belong in such a young face. "My name is Mercy," she said, as if testing whether he would care about such things. "I am called Swift Arrow." He studied her carefully, noting the way she held herself ready to run or hide, even though she clearly lacked the strength for either. "Where is your family, little one?" Something flickered across the child's face, pain deeper than her physical wounds. "They left me," she said simply. "Said I was slowing them down." The words hit Swift Arrow like a physical blow. Among the Comanche, abandoning a child was unthinkable. Even during the hardest winters, when food was scarce and the band had to move quickly to survive, children were protected above everything else. The idea of leaving one behind was so foreign it made his stomach turn. "They left you on purpose?" he asked, needing to be certain he understood correctly. Mercy nodded, then immediately seemed to regret the movement, as it made her dizzy. "Thomas, that's my stepfather," he said. "The wagon was too heavy. That I ate too much food and walked too slow." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she had accepted this explanation completely. Swift Arrow felt anger kindle in his chest, not at the child, but at the adults who had failed her so completely. How could any grown person look at this small, vulnerable creature and decide she was disposable? He pulled his water pouch from his belt and held it to her cracked lips. "Drink slowly," he instructed. Mercy obeyed, taking tiny sips that seemed to bring some life back to her pale face. When she had drunk enough, Swift Arrow sat back on his heels and considered his options. Taking her to his band would create complications. The cavalry often followed missing white children, and soldiers meant trouble for everyone. But leaving her here meant certain death, and Swift Arrow found he couldn't live with that choice. "Can you ride?" he asked. "A little," Mercy said hopefully. "My papa taught me before he died." Swift Arrow made his decision. He lifted the child carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, and settled her against his chest. She felt fragile as a baby bird, all hollow bones and racing heartbeat. As he carried her toward his horse, Mercy spoke again, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Why are you helping me? I'm just a burden." The question stopped Swift Arrow in his tracks. He looked down at the small face peeking up at him, seeing the genuine confusion there. This child truly believed she was worthless, that her life had no value beyond what she could provide for others. "Little one," he said gently, "my people believe that when the spirits send us something unexpected, it is usually because we need it, even if we don't understand why yet." Mercy considered this as he boosted her onto his horse and swung up behind her. "What if the spirits made a mistake?" she asked. Swift Arrow guided his horse toward the distant hills where his band was camped. "The spirits do not make mistakes," he said firmly, "but sometimes it takes us a while to understand their gifts." As they rode through the gathering dusk, Swift Arrow found himself wondering what gift this small, lost child might represent. All he knew for certain was that finding her had changed something in his chest, had awakened a protective instinct he hadn't felt since his younger sister was born. Behind them, the buzzards wheeled one more time before dispersing, disappointed. Their feast would have to wait for another day. The strange singing woke her first. Mercy's eyes opened to painted buffalo hide above her head, decorated with red and blue symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, nothing like the musty canvas of her family's wagon. Voices surrounded her soft, musical words in a language that flowed like water over stones. Her throat felt like sandpaper, but when she tried to sit up, gentle hands pressed her back down. A woman's face appeared above her, bronze skin marked with tiny blue dots along her cheekbones. Her dark hair was braided with colorful beads and white feathers that caught the light. "Water," Mercy whispered. The woman smiled and lifted a wooden bowl to her lips. The liquid was warm and tasted of herbs she didn't know, but it soothed her burning throat. As she drank, memories came flooding back the creek, the fever, the man with long black hair who had found her. "Thank you," Mercy said, her voice barely a croak. The woman pointed to herself. "Bright moon." Then she pointed to Mercy with raised eyebrows. "Mercy." She paused, remembering her stepfather's harsh words about her name. Mercy Whitman. Bright Moon repeated the name carefully, then spoke in her own language to someone Mercy couldn't see. A man's voice answered from outside the tent, and Bright Moon nodded with satisfaction. "Swift Arrow says you are awake 3 days," Bright Moon said in broken English. "You were very sick, little bird." 3 days? Mercy tried to remember, but everything after seeing Swift Arrow's face was fuzzy. "Where am I?" "Safe place," Bright Moon said simply. "Healing place." As if summoned by their conversation, Swift Arrow ducked through the tent opening. In the firelight, he looked different than Mercy remembered younger, with kind eyes that studied her face with concern. He carried something in his hands, and when he knelt beside her, she gasped. It was her father's wooden bird, the one that had fallen into the creek. But how could that be possible? "You found it," she breathed, reaching for the carved figure with trembling fingers. "Creek gave it back," Swift Arrow said in careful English. "Sometimes lost things find their way home when they are ready." Mercy turned the bird over in her hands. The blue paint was gone, washed away by the water, but the smooth wood felt warm and familiar. "My papa made this for me before he died." Swift Arrow and Bright Moon exchanged a look. "Your father is in the spirit world?" Bright Moon asked gently. Mercy nodded, surprised to find that talking about it didn't hurt as much as it used to. "The fever took him last winter. Then Mama married Thomas, and he said I was too much trouble to keep." "This Thomas," Swift Arrow said slowly, "he is the one who left you by the creek?" "He said the wagon was too heavy." The words came out matter-of-factly, but Swift Arrow's expression darkened. Bright Moon said something sharp in their language, and Swift Arrow replied with what sounded like agreement. They spoke back and forth for several minutes, while Mercy listened to the musical flow of their words. "We do not understand white people ways," Bright Moon said finally. "Children are gifts from the spirits. They are sacred." Sacred. Mercy had never heard herself described that way before. In her world, children were responsibilities, burdens to be fed and clothed, and taught proper behavior. The idea that she might be sacred felt impossible. "But I'm not even a good child," she said. "I eat too much food, and I can't walk as fast as everyone else, and I cry too much and—" "Stop." Swift Arrow's voice was firm but gentle. "Who told you these things?" "Thomas. And sometimes Mama, when she thought I wasn't listening." Mercy's voice grew smaller. "They're not wrong. I know I'm too much trouble." Swift Arrow was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his words were careful and clear. "In my people's way of thinking, There is no such thing as too much trouble when it comes to children. Children are the future walking among us. They carry tomorrow in their hearts. Mercy had never heard anything like this before. In her world, children were supposed to be quiet, obedient, and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they received. The idea that she might be valuable simply for existing was harder to accept than medicine. "Would you like to see our camp?" Bright Moon asked. "You have been sleeping for many days. The sun and fresh air will help you grow strong again." Mercy nodded, though her legs felt shaky when Bright Moon helped her stand. Someone had dressed her in soft buckskin clothes instead of her torn calico dress. The leather was decorated with tiny beads in patterns that looked like flowers and birds. Outside the tent, the world was completely different from anything Mercy had ever seen. Buffalo hide homes dotted the grassland in a rough circle, each one painted with different symbols and designs. Women worked around cooking fires, tending to bubbling pots that smelled delicious. Children ran between the tents, playing games with hoops and sticks, their laughter mixing with the sounds of horses and dogs. But what struck Mercy most was how the adults watched the children. There was no impatience in their eyes, no irritation when a small boy accidentally knocked over a water pot, or when a girl's excited shouts interrupted adult conversation. Instead, there was amusement, affection, and something that looked like pride. "Come," Bright Moon said, taking Mercy's hand. "You must eat real food now, not just healing broth." They walked toward the largest fire, where several women were preparing what looked like a feast. Mercy expected to feel out of place, to have everyone stare at her with suspicion or fear. Instead, the women smiled and spoke welcoming words in their own language, gesturing for her to sit on a soft buffalo robe. One woman, her hair streaked with gray, offered Mercy a piece of roasted meat that tasted better than anything she remembered eating. Another brought her sweet berries mixed with something that might have been honey. "They like you," Swift Arrow said, settling beside her. "Morning Star says you have brave eyes. Laughing Water thinks you are sent by the spirits to bring us good fortune." "But I don't bring good fortune," Mercy protested. "I bring trouble. Ask anyone." "We are asking you," Swift Arrow said simply. "What do you think you bring?" The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her opinion about herself before. Adults told children what they were good or bad, helpful or troublesome, wanted or unwanted. The idea that she might have some say in defining herself was startling. "I don't know," she admitted. "Then we will help you learn," Bright Moon said. "But first, you must promise us something." Mercy tensed, waiting for conditions and rules and expectations she would inevitably fail to meet. "Promise us you will try to see yourself through our eyes, not through the eyes of people who could not recognize a gift when it was given to them." As the sun set over the prairie and the cooking fires painted everything in warm golden light, Mercy made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who seemed to believe she was worth the effort of trying. "Today, you learn to disappear," Swift Arrow announced, leading Mercy away from the camp as dawn painted the sky pink and orange. She had been with the band for 2 weeks now, growing stronger each day under Bright Moon's care and the nourishing food the women prepared. Her clothes fit better, her cheeks had filled out, and the constant ache of hunger had become a memory. But this morning felt different, purposeful, in a way that made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. "Disappear?" Mercy asked, hurrying to keep up with his long strides through the tall grass. "The most important skill for survival," Swift Arrow said. "Not fighting, not running. Becoming invisible when you need to be." They stopped in a meadow dotted with wildflowers and scattered rocks. To Mercy, it looked like empty prairie, but Swift Arrow studied it like a map written in a language only he could read. "See that hawk circling above us?" He pointed to a bird riding the morning thermals. "Right now, he sees 2 humans walking in the open. But watch." Swift Arrow crouched low and moved toward a cluster of bushes, his body flowing like water over stones. Even though Mercy was watching carefully, she lost sight of him within moments. The hawk continued its lazy circles, showing no sign of alarm. "How did you do that?" she called softly. His voice came from somewhere she couldn't pinpoint. "I became part of what was already here instead of fighting against it. Your turn. But I don't know how." "Stop thinking about what you don't know." His invisible voice interrupted. "Think about what you do know. You are small, quiet, good at noticing things. These are gifts, not problems." Mercy looked around the meadow, trying to see it the way Swift Arrow might. There a patch of tall grass near some rocks, with shadows that might hide a small person. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled toward it, moving slowly and trying to disturb as little as possible. "Better," Swift Arrow's voice said, though she still couldn't see him. "But you're thinking too hard. Let your body remember how to be quiet. You already know this. You practiced it for years in your stepfather's wagon." The words hit her like a revelation. She had practiced being invisible, trying to take up as little space as possible, moving silently to avoid Thomas's anger. Skills she'd learned from survival could become tools for a different kind of life. She settled into the grass and let her breathing slow, the way she used to when she needed to become unnoticeable. The world around her seemed to shift and settle, accepting her presence as part of itself. I'm sorry to interrupt you right here, but if you're enjoying this story thus far, please consider to subscribe to our channel so that you can enjoy so many more in the future. And by the way, don't hesitate to like the video as well, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Now enjoy the rest of the story. The hawk above them circled once more, then flew away toward the distant hills. "Good," Swift Arrow said, materializing from behind a rock she would have sworn was empty. "Very good. Now comes the harder lesson." "Harder than disappearing?" "Much harder." His expression grew serious. "Learning to reappear when you choose to, not when someone else decides you're worth seeing." They spent the morning practicing what Swift Arrow called shadow walking, moving through different terrains without leaving obvious tracks, using natural cover, reading the landscape for hiding places and escape routes. But between lessons, he asked questions that seemed to have nothing to do with survival skills. "When you lived with your family, did you ever speak your true thoughts?" "I tried to stay quiet mostly. But when you did speak, what happened?" Mercy considered this. "Thomas would get angry if I asked for things. Mama would look sad if I talked about Papa. So I learned what not to say." "And what did you want to say?" The question opened something inside her chest, a flood of words and feelings she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten they existed. "I wanted to ask why Papa had to die. I wanted to tell Mama that I missed our old house. I wanted to say that I was scared about going to California and that I didn't understand why Thomas hated me so much, and that sometimes I had dreams where Papa came back and everything was the way it used to be." Swift Arrow nodded as if this made perfect sense. Those are important words, words that needed to be spoken. But they would have made everyone upset. Sometimes the most important words do make people upset. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be said. They had found their way to a small creek where Swift Arrow taught her how to cross moving water without disturbing the mud or leaving footprints on the banks. The lesson required careful balance and patience, placing each foot precisely while reading the current and the depth. "Why are you teaching me this?" Mercy asked as they sat on the far bank, sharing dried meat and wild berries that Bright Moon had packed for them. "Because knowledge is power," Swift Arrow said. "The more you know about surviving on your own, the more choices you have. Choices are freedom." "But I'm just a child. Children don't get to choose things." "Says who?" The question was so simple it was startling. "Says everyone. Adults make decisions for children because children don't know enough." "Do you think you know enough to choose whether you want to be treated with kindness or cruelty?" "Well, yes. But do you know enough to choose whether you want to eat when you're hungry?" "Of course. Do you know enough to choose whether you want to live with people who see you as a gift or people who see you as a burden?" Mercy was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over smooth stones. I think so. Then you know enough to make the choices that matter most. As the day wore on, Swift Arrow taught her to identify edible plants, to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, and to find water by following game trails. But woven through every practical lesson was something deeper, different way of seeing herself and her place in the world. In your white settlements, he said as they watched a family of rabbits emerge from their burrow to feed in the late afternoon light, who decides a person's worth? Important people, I guess. People with money or land or education. And what makes them qualified to judge? Mercy had never considered this before. They just are. Because they're successful. Successful at what? At being important. Swift Arrow smiled. That is circular thinking, little one. They are important because they are successful. And they are successful because they are important. But what if importance and worth are different things? He pointed to the rabbits, who were teaching their young ones where to find the sweetest grass. The rabbit mother is not important in your world's way of thinking. She owns no land, has no money, holds no title, but she knows things that keep her family alive. She has worth that cannot be measured by human standards. So worth comes from what you know, what you can do. Worth comes from being alive. Swift Arrow said simply. Everything else, knowledge, skills, achievements, those are gifts you give to the world. But your worth exists before you give anything at all. As they walked back toward camp, Mercy felt something shifting inside her understanding of herself. For 9 years, she had believed that her value came from being useful, from not causing trouble, from earning the right to exist through good behavior. But Swift Arrow and his people seemed to believe that her existence itself was valuable, that her thoughts and feelings and dreams mattered simply because they were hers. What if I'm not brave enough to believe that? She asked as the camp's cooking fires came into view. Then you practice believing it, Swift Arrow said, the same way you practiced becoming invisible, a little bit at a time, until it becomes as natural as breathing. That night, as Mercy lay on her buffalo robes, listening to the familiar sounds of the camp settling into sleep, she whispered a small practice to herself. I matter because I'm alive. My thoughts are important because they're mine. I have worth that nobody can take away. The words felt strange and powerful, like magic spells that might change everything if she could learn to believe them completely. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, a nightbird called out a song that sounded almost like hope. The thunder of 30 horses shook the ground beneath Mercy's feet like an earthquake made of anger and steel. She dropped the wild berries she'd been gathering and ran toward the camp, her heart beating so fast it hurt. Behind her, dust clouds rose higher than trees, and the sound of metal jangling grew louder with each second. Swift Arrow appeared beside her like a shadow, his strong arms lifting her onto his horse without breaking stride. Soldiers, he said, his voice tight as a drawn bow. Many soldiers. The Comanche camp exploded into movement. Women grabbed children and precious belongings. Warriors reached for weapons and painted horses. Dogs barked warnings while elders shouted instructions in voices that cut through the chaos like knives through butter. Mercy's stomach twisted into knots. She had heard the older children whisper about blue-coat soldiers who came to take Indian children to faraway schools where they forgot their families forever. But she had never imagined they might come for her too. Hide me, she whispered to Swift Arrow as they raced between the tippahs. Please, don't let them take me back. Swift Arrow's jaw hardened like stone. Little rabbit, some fights cannot be avoided, but they can be won. The cavalry burst into view like a blue wave crashing against the shore. Their horses snorted and stamped, tired from hard riding but still dangerous. The captain at the front had eyes like winter ice and a mustache that twitched when he spoke. Behind him rode soldiers with rifles across their saddles and expressions that said they expected trouble. But it was the man riding beside the captain that made Mercy's blood turn cold. Thomas Brennan sat straight in his saddle, pointing directly at her with a finger that shook with excitement. "There she is. That's the Whitman girl. I told you the savages had taken her." The word savages hit the air like a slap. Several Comanche warriors took steps forward, their hands moving toward their weapons. The tension stretched tight as a rope about to snap. Captain Morrison Mercy could see his name sewn onto his blue jacket, raised one hand to stop his soldiers from drawing their guns. With his other hand, he gestured for the Comanche to stay calm. He was older than most of his men, with gray streaking his brown hair and scars on his face that spoke of many battles. "I am Captain Morrison of the Texas Rangers," he called out in a voice that carried across the entire camp. "We're here for the white child. No one needs to get hurt if you cooperate." Chief Running Bear stepped forward, magnificent in his eagle feather headdress and painted war shirt. Though he was past his 50th winter, he moved with the grace of a much younger man. When he spoke, his English was perfect and sharp as a blade. "Captain Morrison, you are welcome to water your horses and rest your men, but you are not welcome to make demands in my camp." The two leaders faced each other like wolves, deciding whether to fight or flee. Around them, 30 soldiers fingered their rifles, while 60 Comanche warriors stood ready to defend their home. The air crackled with a kind of danger that made smart people hold their breath. Mercy slipped down from Swift Arrow's horse and walked slowly toward the center of the camp. Every eye followed her movement. She was just one small girl, but somehow she had become the spark that could start a fire that would burn down everything. "Captain Morrison," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Mercy Whitman." The captain studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He saw her braided hair with feathers woven through it. He saw her buckskin dress decorated with beads and porcupine quills. He saw her sun-darkened skin and the confidence in her posture that hadn't been there when she was abandoned months ago. "Miss Whitman," he said carefully, "your stepfather here says you were kidnapped by these Indians. He's been searching for you for months." Thomas nudged his horse closer, his face red with the effort of looking like a concerned parent. "Mercy, honey, don't be afraid. These savages can't hurt you anymore. Uncle Sam's army is here to take you home." Home. The word sat in Mercy's mouth like a stone. She looked around the camp that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. She saw Bright Moon's worried face, Swift Arrow's protective stance, and the dozens of people who had made room for her in their hearts without asking for anything in return. "Mr. Brennan," she said, using his formal name on purpose, "where is my mother?" The question seemed to surprise him. He shifted in his saddle and glanced at Captain Morrison before answering. "Your mother. She took sick on the trail. The fever got her, child." "That's why I came back for you. Family has to stick together." But Mercy had spent months learning to read faces the way Swift Arrow read animal tracks. She saw the lie hiding behind Thomas's eyes, like a snake in tall grass. She saw the way his hand shook slightly and how he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "You're lying," she said simply. The words dropped into the silence, like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through both groups. Thomas's face went from red to white to red again. "Now, see here, you little." "That's enough." Captain Morrison cut him off with a voice like a whip crack. He turned back to Mercy with new interest. "What makes you say he's lying, child?" Mercy took a deep breath, tasting the moment that would change everything. Around her, she felt the weight of 60 Comanche lives hanging on her next words. Behind her, she felt the strength of people who had chosen to love her without conditions. This was it, the moment when she would either save her new family or watch them suffer for her sake. But what truth could a 9-year-old girl tell that would make hardened soldiers believe her over a white man's word? "Because he's the one who left me to die." Mercy's words exploded across the camp like gunpowder, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Captain Morrison's weathered face went stone still, while Thomas Brennan's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. That's ridiculous," Thomas sputtered, his voice climbing higher with each word. "She's been living with savages for months. They've filled her head with lies and poison against her own kind." But Captain Morrison held up his hand for silence, his gray eyes never leaving Mercy's face. In 20 years of frontier service, he had learned to spot truth in the most unlikely places. Something in this child's steady gaze reminded him of his own daughter back in Austin. "Explain yourself, Miss Whitman," he said quietly. Mercy felt her knees shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. Around her, she could sense the Comanche warriors ready to fight and die for her if necessary. The weight of their trust gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. "We were 3 days past Willow Creek when our wagon broke an axle," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mr. Brennan said we were behind schedule because of me. He said I ate too much food and walked too slow and made the wagon too heavy." She pointed directly at Thomas, whose face had gone pale as winter sky. "He told my mother they had to choose between making it to California or keeping me. So they left me by Cottonwood Creek with 3 pieces of hardtack and directions to find the Henderson family." "Lies!" Thomas shouted, but his voice cracked like thin ice. "The girl's confused. She's been brainwashed by these heathens." Captain Morrison raised his hand again, but this time his movement was sharp enough to make several soldiers reach for their weapons. "Let her finish." Mercy's heart pounded like war drums, but she pressed on. "My mother cried when she said goodbye. She told me to follow the North Star and that the Hendersons would take me in if I was good enough. But I got sick before I found them. I had fever and couldn't keep water down, and I would have died if Swift Arrow hadn't found me." She gestured toward the tall Comanche hunter, who stood silent and proud beside his horse. "He saved my life when my own family threw it away." Thomas spurred his horse forward, his face twisted with desperate anger. "You can't believe this child over a grown white man. She's been corrupted by living with Indians. They've turned her against her own people." But Captain Morrison was studying Thomas now with the same careful attention he'd given Mercy. The captain's eyes took in the man's nervous gestures, his shifting gaze, and the way sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Mr. Brennan," the captain said slowly, "where exactly did you say your wagon train was attacked?" What does that matter? The important thing is getting the girl back where she belongs. Humor me." Thomas's hands trembled on his reins. "It was near Eagle Pass." "Yes, Eagle Pass. That's where the Comanches hit us." Captain Morrison exchanged glances with his sergeant, a grizzled man named O'Sullivan, who had been fighting Indians for 15 years. O'Sullivan shook his head slightly. "Interesting," the captain said, "because there haven't been any Comanche raids near Eagle Pass in over 2 years, and certainly no reports of captured children." The lie hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Thomas's face went through several colors before settling on a sickly yellow-green. "Perhaps," Captain Morrison continued, "you'd like to revise your story, Mr. Brennan?" But Thomas was past the point of clever lies. Desperation made him dangerous as a cornered wolf. "It doesn't matter how she got here. She's a white child living with savages. It's not natural. It's not Christian. You have a duty to bring her back to civilization." Swift Arrow stepped forward then, his movement fluid as water, but unmistakably threatening. When he spoke, his English was careful and precise. "Captain Morrison, this man speaks of duty and civilization, but what civilization abandons its children to die alone?" "Now you listen here, Redskin," Thomas started. "No." The captain's voice cut like a cavalry saber. "You listen, Brennan. I've heard enough." He turned to address both groups, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making life-and-death decisions. "In 20 years of service, I've seen men lie about many things. But I've never seen a child lie about being abandoned. That kind of pain doesn't come from imagination." Thomas made one last desperate play. Even if what she says is true, she's still a white child. She can't stay with Indians. It's against the law." "Whose law?" Chief Running Bear spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. The same law that allows a man to abandon a child like unwanted baggage? Captain Morrison looked around the camp, taking in the faces of people who had clearly welcomed Mercy as one of their own. He saw Bright Moon standing protectively near the girl, her hand resting gently on Mercy's shoulder. He saw the careful way the Comanche children included her in their games, and the respect in the warriors' eyes when they looked at her. Then he looked at Thomas Brennan and saw a man whose greed for gold had overcome his basic humanity. "Sergeant O'Sullivan," the captain said finally. "Yes, sir?" "Place Mr. Brennan under arrest for child abandonment and filing a false report with the territorial government." Thomas's face went white as cotton. "You can't do this. She's just one half-dead brat. No one will miss her." But even as the sergeant moved to restrain him, Thomas's words had sealed his fate. In trying to justify his actions, he had confirmed everything Mercy had said. As the soldiers prepared to escort their prisoner away, Captain Morrison approached Mercy one final time. His gruff features had softened slightly, revealing the father beneath the officer. "Miss Whitman," he said gently, "I can't leave you here. The territorial government has strict policies about white children living with Indian tribes. But I give you my word that we'll find you a good home with people who will value you properly." Mercy looked up at him with eyes that held more wisdom than any 9-year-old should possess. "Captain Morrison, what if I told you I've already found that?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. In the distance, Thomas Brennan's angry shouts grew fainter as the soldiers led him away to face justice for his crimes. But justice for Thomas didn't solve the larger problem. What happened when the law said one thing and the heart said another? The church bell rang loud and clear across the snowy Texas town, but 9-year-old Mercy Whitman barely heard it anymore. Sunday mornings had become as regular as breathing during her 6 months with the Henderson family. She sat straight in the wooden pew, hands folded like a proper young lady, listening to Preacher Williams talk about being grateful for God's plan. But her mind kept wandering to a different kind of prayer, the ones Bright Moon had taught her under the stars, where gratitude mixed with wild freedom instead of quiet sitting. "Mercy, dear, you're fidgeting again," whispered Mrs. Henderson, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Mercy forced herself to sit still. The Hendersons were good people who had given her a warm home, plenty of food, and new dresses that fit perfectly. She should be happy. Everyone said so. The preacher said so. The other families in town said so. Even Mercy told herself so every morning when she brushed her hair into neat braids instead of the loose style Bright Moon had shown her. After church, the families gathered outside to talk about weather and crops while children played tag in the snow. Mercy stood next to Mrs. Henderson, smiling politely when adults patted her head and said what a blessing it was that she'd been saved from those savages. Each time someone said those words, something twisted in her stomach like a knife. But she had learned to nod and say, "Yes, sir," or "Yes, ma'am," because disagreeing made people uncomfortable, and making people uncomfortable meant they might not want to keep her. That afternoon, while Mr. Henderson read stories to his twin boys by the fire, Mercy helped Mrs. Henderson bake bread for the sick families in town. The kitchen smelled like home, warm and yeasty and safe. Mrs. Henderson hummed while she worked, occasionally asking Mercy to fetch this or measure that. "You've been quieter than usual lately," Mrs. Henderson said as they kneaded the dough together. "Is something troubling you?" Mercy's hands stilled in the soft, warm dough. How could she explain that she felt like she was slowly disappearing? That every day she acted more like the girl everyone expected her to be? She forgot a little more about who she really was? "I'm fine, ma'am," she said instead, because that's what good girls said. Mrs. Henderson studied her face with kind but worried eyes. "You know you can tell me anything, don't you? Nothing you could say would change how much we care about you." The words were meant to comfort, but they only made the ache in Mercy's chest grow bigger. Because she knew with the sharp knowledge that comes from experience that there were absolutely things she could say that would change everything. Things about feeling more at home in a teepee than a farmhouse. Things about missing the taste of buffalo meat and the sound of drums. Things about dreaming in a language that wasn't English. "I know, ma'am," Mercy said quietly, returning to her kneading. Later that evening, after the bread was delivered and supper was eaten and prayers were said, Mercy lay in her soft bed, staring at the ceiling. Through her window, she could see snow falling in thick, lazy flakes. The sight reminded her of the first time she'd seen snow with the Comanche how Swift Arrow had caught flakes on his tongue and laughed when she tried to do the same. She reached under her mattress and pulled out Bright Moon's medicine bundle, unwrapping it carefully in the darkness. Inside were dried herbs that still held their scent, a small piece of turquoise, and a tiny carved horse that one of the Comanche children had given her. Touching these treasures was like touching a different version of herself, one who didn't have to apologize for taking up space. A soft sound outside her window made her freeze. It was probably just the wind in the trees, or maybe a cat hunting mice in the barn, but something about it made her heart beat faster. The sound came again, definitely not wind, more like a horse shifting its weight, the leather of a saddle creaking softly. Mercy slipped out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to let the floorboards squeak. She pressed her face to the cold glass and peered out into the snowy yard. At first, she saw nothing but white shapes and shadows. Then, at the edge of the tree line where the Hendersons' property met the wild prairie, she spotted something that made her breath catch in her throat. A rider sat perfectly still on his horse, watching the house. Even in the darkness and falling snow, even though months had passed since she'd seen him, she knew exactly who it was. Swift Arrow had come back. Her hands shook as she pressed them against the window glass. He was really there, not a dream or a wishful thought, but flesh and blood and warmth in the cold night. He had risked everything soldiers and laws and the danger of being shot on sight to find her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the snowy distance. Then Swift Arrow raised one hand in a small gesture, not quite a wave, not quite a signal, but something that said, "I see you." Mercy's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't let herself cry in months. Someone had remembered her. Someone had come looking for the real Mercy, not the polite, grateful version she'd been pretending to be. She pressed her hand to the glass in answer, and even though he couldn't possibly see such a small movement from so far away, Swift Arrow nodded once before, melting back into the shadows. Mercy stood at her window long after he disappeared, her heart pounding with possibility and fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. She had a choice to make now, the biggest choice of her life. And for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Act X. Dawn broke pink and gold over the Texas prairie, painting the snow-covered ground in colors that made Mercy think of the sunrise ceremonies Bright Moon had shared with her. She stood at the crossroads where the path to the Henderson farm split away from the old Comanche trail, her small satchel heavy with the few things that truly mattered. Inside the bag, her father's wooden bird, worn smooth from countless touches, Bright Moon's medicine bundle, carefully rewrapped in soft deerskin, a letter for the Hendersons explaining her choice in words she hoped they would understand, and 3 pieces of hardtack, not because she needed them for the journey, but because they reminded her of how far she'd come from that scared, abandoned child by the creek. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of snow and pine and something else, something wild and free that called to the part of her she'd been hiding for too long. Mercy had left before the Hendersons woke up, before Mrs. Henderson could make her favorite pancakes or Mr. Henderson could read the morning prayers. She'd slipped away like morning mist, leaving only the letter on her neatly made bed to explain where she'd gone. Writing that letter had been the hardest thing she'd ever done, harder even than watching her mother's wagon disappear into the dust. Because the Hendersons had been truly kind to her, and leaving felt like betraying that kindness. But she had finally understood the difference between being grateful and being true to herself. She could be both, but not in the same place. As she walked west along the barely visible trail, following signs that most people would never notice a bent branch here. A particular arrangement of stones there, Mercy felt pieces of herself clicking back into place like puzzle pieces, finding their proper spots. The sun climbed higher, warming her face and melting the snow into tiny streams that sparkled like diamonds. She passed a family of rabbits playing in a clearing, their brown fur stark against the white ground. One of them sat up on its hind legs and watched her pass, and Mercy smiled, remembering Swift Arrow's lessons about being quick and clever like the rabbit. By midday, she could smell wood smoke on the wind, the particular scent of buffalo chips burning that meant Comanche fires. Her steps quickened, and she began to see familiar landmarks: the lightning, split oak tree, the red rocks shaped like a sleeping bear, the hill where she'd first learned to identify different types of clouds. Then, spread out before her like a picture from a wonderful dream, she saw the camp. The tippas stood in their traditional circle, hide covers painted with symbols that told stories of hunts and visions and family histories. Horses grazed peacefully in the distance, their winter coats thick and shaggy. Children played in the snow, their laughter carrying on the clear air like music. And there, working on arrows outside his tipi, was Swift Arrow. He looked up as if he'd felt her watching him, and the smile that spread across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He stood slowly, setting down his work, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance. "Little Rabbit," he called, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "Swift Arrow," she called back, and suddenly her feet were running without her permission, carrying her across the snowy ground toward home. Bright Moon emerged from her teepee at the sound of voices, and when she saw Mercy running toward them, she let out a cry of joy that brought the whole camp spilling out to see what was happening. Soon Mercy was surrounded by familiar faces, familiar voices speaking her name, familiar hands touching her hair and face, as if to make sure she was real. "You came back," Bright Moon said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pulled Mercy into a fierce hug. "I came home," Mercy corrected, breathing in the scent of sage and wood smoke and belonging that clung to Bright Moon's clothes. That evening, as the camp settled into its nightly rhythms around her, Mercy sat by the central fire and told her story. She spoke of the Hendersons' kindness and the warm house and the church with its tall bell tower. She talked about learning to bake bread and mend clothes and speak only when spoken to. "They were good to me," she said carefully, "but good to me and good for me are different things." The adults nodded, understanding flickering in their eyes. Among the Comanche, children were valued for who they were, not who they might become with enough training and correction. "And what are you, Mercy, who chooses her own path?" asked the chief, an old man whose voice carried the weight of many seasons. Mercy touched the wooden bird at her throat, thinking of her father and the love that had carved it, thinking of her mother's trembling hands and the fear that had driven her away, thinking of the Hendersons' kindness and Swift Arrow's rescue and Bright Moon's wisdom. "I am someone who belongs wherever she chooses to belong," she said finally. "Someone whose worth comes from inside, not from what other people think about her. Someone who was lost and then found, and then lost again, but who finally found herself." "Yes," said the chief quietly, "you are." As the fire burned low and the stars emerged overhead, Mercy lay in the teepee that had always been waiting for her return. Outside, an owl called across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. She was no longer the abandoned child crying in the wilderness. She was no longer the grateful orphan trying to earn her place. She was Mercy, who had learned that the most important journey wasn't the one that took you away from yourself, but the one that brought you home to who you really were. And in choosing her own belonging, she had discovered something more valuable than safety or comfort or even love. She had found her own worth, claimed it for herself, and learned that once claimed, it could never be taken away again. The prairie wind whispered through the camp, carrying promises of spring and new beginnings. and Mercy smiled as she drifted off to sleep, finally and completely home.